The United States will run Venezuela and US oil companies will fix the country's broken infrastructure and start making money for the country. So President Donald Trump declared on January the 3rd as he announced that US troops had captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and whisked him to New York. The extraordinary intervention raises far-reaching questions about the limits of international law, about the American president's ability to exert executive power, about the US's desire to direct the natural resources of other countries. But the saga also raises urgent issues about the decades-old tussle over oil. Does the US really want more control of Venezuela's reserves? Will US oil companies really go back into a country where their assets have been confiscated on more than one occasion? What is the Trump administration trying to achieve? And do its ambitions extend beyond Venezuela? These are the questions we will be debating on The Big View this week. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Tharlarsen. To talk all this over, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Crooks. Ed is Vice Chair of Wood Mackenzie, the research and consulting firm. He joined Wood Mac in 2019 from the Financial Times, which is where I first met him. He spent 2 decades at the paper, including as energy editor and economics editor in New York and London. He's also the host of Wood Mac's Energy Gang podcast. Ed Crooks, welcome to The Big View.
Hello. Thanks very much for having me on.
You're very welcome. So let's start with, you're a very close watcher of the energy industry. How much of a surprise was it for you to wake up on the morning of, January the 3rd, Saturday, to find that US troops had swooped into Caracas overnight?
Yeah, so 2 answers to that question, I think. One is the specifics, I have to say, were a complete surprise. That whole operation is not at all what I had expected or imagined might happen. On the other hand, that there was going to be a move by the US against Venezuela was very, very predictable, indeed widely predicted. It had been telegraphed many months in advance. In private conversations I'd been having with people for much of last year, it was clear the US was intent on doing something. And if you saw the actions that were being taken, for instance, seizing the tankers, if you saw the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration and so on, it was very clear that they were putting themselves in a position to take some action. I think we thought maybe there would be something a bit more aggressive almost. There might be some kind of invasion or more US troops on the ground, or US troops kind of getting on the ground and staying there. So far, we've not seen that. But as I say, it was very clear, given the way things were going, that the US was going to make a move and that oil was going to be at the heart of it.
Right. I'm actually personally very grateful that they didn't do it when they were originally intending to do it, which I think was 4 or 5 days earlier. So at least we managed to preserve that little bit of holiday.
Indeed. Well, I'd heard the story. One of the original ideas was to do it on Christmas Eve, which would have absolutely ruined our holidays. And then, as you say, there was talk about doing it in between Christmas and New Year, but then conditions weren't right, apparently. And so that's why they ended up with the 3rd.
So it sort of opened up, it's quite interesting to sort of look into the long history of Venezuelan oil and the US and Venezuela as well. I mean, in some ways, this is a sort of a saga that's been going on for decades, right? Possibly for centuries.
Yeah, many decades. I mean, maybe not quite centuries plural, but certainly kind of over a century. That exactly it goes back definitely more than 100 years. Jostling over the future of Venezuela has been a feature of US policy going back at least to the early 20th century. It's been very interesting. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the Monroe Doctrine, this idea that the US has the exclusive right to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. And the the corollary to that, what was called the Roosevelt corollary, which was that the US sometimes has a duty to intervene in countries in the Western Hemisphere when other powers won't intervene. So that was promoted really over Venezuela originally back in sort of 1904, 1905. And so now you hear President Trump talking about the Donroe Doctrine, this idea, or also sometimes called the Trump corollary. He's used that language as well, talking about the Trump corollary to the Donroe Doctrine, which again has that same meaning. So it's very much continuity with where the US was 120 years ago.
And has that always been over oil? Has it always been sort of a question really of they've got oil and the US wants some control over it?
It has not at the very beginning been about oil, but yeah, Venezuela has been an important oil producer for a very long time. So it was an important oil producer back in the 1920s. There was a time when half the oil used in Europe came from Venezuela. It's got a very, very long history there, of course, instrumental in the formation of OPEC and so on. So, it's one of the really long-standing oil powers, ranking alongside key regions in the Middle East and elsewhere. So, yeah, definitely none of this is sort of unprecedented or surprising in that sense, that questions about power and politics and oil have always been very significant in Venezuela and have for a very long time, but that way influenced Venezuela's relations with the US and the rest of the world.
One of my favorite new historical fact, which I discovered as I was reading up in preparation for this discussion actually over the weekend, was Richard Nixon, when he was vice president, was nearly killed by a mob in Caracas during a visit in 1958. I guess shortly before before the formation of OPEC.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, just and of course, everyone always says it's in the prize, but if you go back and read Dan Jurgen's fantastic book, The Prize, a lot of this history is spelled out there, and Venezuela plays a big part in that story.
So one thing, maybe just to bring it back to the present day, was I was struck by Trump during that press conference on January 3rd talking about stolen oil. What is that? What was he referring to? Do we know?
Yes, well, as Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, said when he went with that group of oil executives to the White House, Venezuela has actually expropriated assets from Western oil companies and from Exxon in particular twice just within the past 50 years or so. Once in 1975-76, when there was forced nationalization. The two big foreign companies operating in Venezuela at the time were Exxon and Shell, and they had assets taken away from them by the Venezuelan government at that point. And then again in 2005, Exxon and Chevron and ConocoPhillips all had significant assets in Venezuela, and President Hugo Chavez, who was leading Venezuela at the time, pushed to have the contract terms changed for those companies, essentially to give the government of Venezuela more control over those assets. And Chevron chose to stay in the country and continue to operate, and they're there to this day. And ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips decided to pull out and walk away. And then they took action under international arbitration to get compensation for those loss of assets. And I think that's what President Trump is referring to when he's talking about having oil stolen. He means, the equity in those projects that was given up by US companies. I mean, you could argue it's somewhat misleading to talk about that as oil having been stolen. I mean, the oil legally under Venezuelan law certainly always belonged to the country. The companies had concessions. They had the right to operate there and to make a profit from what they were producing. They didn't actually own the oil. But I suppose in kind of loose terminology, you could see that as theft from the companies and therefore, I guess, from their shareholders. And those companies have sued in various courts and international arbitration, let's say, to get compensation. And ConocoPhillips in particular has been awarded a very large sum. They've got about $12 billion or so that they are owed by Venezuela. And that's actually going to be one of the sticking points for companies thinking about going back into Venezuela is what happens still in terms of working out the legacy of those expropriations of assets 20 years ago.
Yeah. And then we should get back to that, the sort of the appetite or maybe lack of it of US companies to go back in. But just maybe just talk a bit about some of the number. We love, breaking views, we love talking about numbers. Um and there's these two charts that I've seen them a few times put side by side. And one shows oil production from Venezuela, which sort of starts up here, and then in sort of 2007 it's about 3 million barrels a day, and then it falls quite dramatically, and now it's below a million. Um, and then the other chart is showing Venezuela's oil reserves, which go along, and then in a 2007, coincidentally, they go up from about 100 billion barrels to 300 billion barrels. So the sort of, I guess the conundrum is, if there's, and everybody talks about Venezuela having the world's largest oil reserves and yet producing so little. So how do we reconcile that? And I guess to what extent does that then tell us something about the value of what could be unlocked?
Yeah, well, as you say, breaking views, you love numbers. This, I think, is a great lesson in not trusting numbers, certainly not trusting numbers at face value, because this whole saga is a great education in oil reserves numbers and how fluid and malleable they are, and how possible it is to come up with very, very different numbers depending on what definitions you use. And as you say, there is a definition, which I suppose you could call technically something like oil in place. The oil that is in the ground in Venezuela absolutely could be 300 billion barrels. Could be a lot more than that, in fact. It's just unclear exactly how much is there, but on one reasonable definition, as you say, the one that was adopted in 2007, 300 billion barrels seems pretty fair. But a few things to say about that. It's also very important to think about the reserves that are economically producible. That oil, because it is very, very heavy oil, it is kind of sort of thick and viscous. It needs to be either processed, what they call upgrading it to sell it, or it needs to be diluted with light oil to make an oil blend that can be sold. It's very expensive to produce often. Some of the projects we've been looking at, we think need an oil price, Brent crude, of about $80 a barrel or more to be financially viable. So that's a long way off where we are at the moment, or even possibly in the long term you'd think would be a reasonable equilibrium oil price. So it's going to be very hard for a lot of those projects to be viable. So if you start knocking out all of those things and you look at just the reserves that are producible economically, you can get much smaller numbers. Now, I mean, actually probably still very significant, and I think our number for proved and probable economically producible reserves is something like 84 billion barrels. So that's not nothing, right? That's still a large amount of oil.
Yeah.
And then if you want to look at just the medium and light oil that doesn't require so much intervention for production and processing to sell it, I think that number's more like 24, 25 billion barrels. Even that is significant. But as I say, these are not the kind of numbers that really put you in the class of having the world's largest oil reserves. And if you compare to, let's say, the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia, which are mostly medium and light in terms of the reserve that they currently report, comparing those to Venezuela's numbers, that's not really an apples to apples comparison. And so, as I say, you just really have to take all of these numbers that you're hearing with big pinch of salt, and to think really about, as I say, what's going to be economically producible. And then when you think about what's happened to oil production in Venezuela, basically the same sort of consideration applies, that its production has been affected by the market and what it's possible to produce economically. And it's also then been affected greatly by the amount of investment in the industry and how well the industry is being run. And we can certainly get into the terrible state of Venezuela's oil industry and what's happened to that, because that's also a big consideration in terms of whether international companies will want to invest there. But again,
Mhm.
that's another reason to not be sort of blinded, dazzled by these very impressive sounding numbers for reserves. There's a lot more to the story than that.
Big numbers. But what do you think is realistic then in terms of reviving production? Because I mean, it's what in 2007 it was 3 million barrels a day. As you say, the market's changed. There's been underinvestment. Obviously, there's also been sanctions, which have limited Venezuela's ability to export. Um, yeah, there are people talk. I've had conversations in the past week with people who say, "Well, look at Iraq. You know, that was I think Saddam Hussein's Iraq was producing about 1 million barrels a day in 2003 when the US invaded. Now it's produced last year. I think it averaged 4 million or something like that. Are these sort of helpful analogies in this context?
Yeah, they're not entirely unhelpful, and I think actually Iraq is a good one in this sense that think about the time it took then. So that invasion of
Mm,
Iraq was what 23 years ago now. For
yeah.
about the first 8 years or so after that invasion, Iraqi production very much flatlined until the situation in terms of security was brought under control. Iraqi oil production went nowhere. And it's only after that that it really started taking off and to grow, as you say, towards the much higher levels that we're looking at today. So maybe that's an analogy that's worth thinking about for Venezuela. I mean, certainly a reminder that you shouldn't expect anything to happen at all immediately. I mean, I say you shouldn't expect anything to happen. There is clearly there's a bit of a bump in oil production, a little bit of a boost that's going to be available from easing sanctions, just letting those tankers come in and out freely and so on. There's going to be a bit of help from allowing them to import diluent, as I say, this kind of light oil that you need to use to blend with the heavy oil to make it saleable. Our number is that you might add about 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day of additional production in the next few months, just from those things happening, those changes. Um, in terms of though that having a big impact on world oil markets, obviously that's a bit of a rounding error. Um, it'll have some impact at the margin. It's not completely negligible, but when you think about the big factors that are in play elsewhere in terms of how much demand is growing, what decisions are being taken by the leading members of the OPEC Plus group in terms of what's happening to US production, that 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day pretty quickly gets lost in the noise. So that's not a big deal. Then in the medium and longer term, as I say, there is definitely potential for more significant growth. In terms of that potential, I think again it's important to be cautious about what anyone is telling you. The data on the state of the Venezuelan oil industry is not great at the moment. It's clear there's been a lot of degradation to the physical assets, and because it's hard to get access to those assets, people don't really know exactly how much spending it's going to take and how quickly assets can be brought back online again. And I thought that was very interesting. Again, going back to Darren Woods talking at that meeting at the White House, that was one of the things he highlighted there. So it's going to be very important for us to get into the country, to send teams of technical experts in there to have a look at it and to work out exactly what needs to be done, how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take. So, as I say, important to be kind of cautious about any claims about what can happen there. But is it possible that oil production could get back to where it was in the mid 2010s? So back to that 2 million barrels a day or so level. So adding about another 1 million barrels a day from where we are at the moment. Yep, that maybe could be done in a few years. That doesn't seem crazy. Could production get back to that 3.5 million barrel a day level that it was at the beginning of the 21st century? Again, not impossible. That is certainly going to take longer, though, and that really means getting some of those heavy oil projects going. One important thing for people to understand about Venezuela's oil industry is that although the heavy oil attracts all the attention, and that's where the big numbers are for the reserves and so on, and it's probably a bit over half of Venezuela's oil production today, maybe as much as 60%. It's actually historically been the case that most of Venezuela's production has been medium and light. And actually, those medium oil fields, so much more conventional oil fields, don't require all this intervention, don't require all this processing for the crude. Production there has also declined very dramatically since 2000. And again, it's not entirely clear how much intervention will be needed, but it's possible that by workovers of the wells, bringing new rigs in to improve the wells, doing what they call repressurizing the formation, so kind of working on the reserves to so that the oil will flow again. There are things that could be done that again could bring that production back up, possibly quite significantly within a few years. But as I say, these conclusions at the moment are all pretty tentative, given the lack of really hard data about the way Venezuela is. And as I say, but given what we do know is that clearly the infrastructure is in a very dilapidated and degraded state.
So how should we think then about the US oil companies? Because there was in the immediate aftermath, there was a lot of loose talk about, oh, this is Trump doing a favor for his buddies in the oil industry, kind of regime change in Venezuela so that they can all go back in and fill their boots. And then obviously you had talked about Darren Woods from ExxonMobil, had him declaring after this meeting at the White House that Venezuela was uninvestable. And then you had Trump saying, well, if he's being, maybe I won't let him in and all this kind of stuff. So I just wondered, how should we think about what do the US oil companies actually want from this, and also what is going to persuade them to go back in?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a divergence of views among US oil companies. Right. It was interesting, as you say, very strong language from Dan Woods at ExxonMobil, talked about Venezuela as uninvestable. Chevron, which has operating assets in Venezuela right now, actually is responsible for probably roughly nearly a quarter of Venezuela's production at the moment. That company was much more circumspect in its comments. You've had, it seems, quite a few smaller oil companies expressing an interest, at least wanting to be seen to express an interest and say, oh, we'd love to get back in there and start working on that industry. So, as I say, views are divided. In principle, there will be a lot of interest from the international oil industry because all these companies are looking for growth. We're in a world where, perhaps compared to where people thought we might be when we were looking at the long-term future of oil demand 3 years ago, let's say, a lot of people now would think that demand is going to be stronger for longer. The whole idea that we'll get to net zero emissions by 2050, for instance, is out of the window. Everyone accepts now that that's not going to happen. And so companies are thinking about markets being stronger into the late 2030s, 2040s and beyond, and thinking, where is growth going to come from for their own businesses? Mm-hmm. And often it's not that easy to see where that's going to be. There aren't that many places in the world that offer very significant oil reserves with growth potential. And in particular, of course, when you think about the US, there's been enormous focus on tight oil onshore in the lower 48 states of the US. This incredible boom that kicked off there in 2010, or around 2010, went roaring ahead, made the US the largest oil producer in the world as it is today. It seems plausible to think that that boom is going to be coming to an end, let's say within the next decade, that by the early 2030s, US oil production will be, peak would be too strong a word, not hitting a peak, but hitting a plateau, put it that way, leveling off, maybe declining very gently, but certainly not offering a lot of growth. And so those companies that have really relied on the US to drive their growth, and clearly they're thinking about ways to find growth still in the US, but they will also be thinking about other places around the world that can give them that growth. And Venezuela, just in terms of its geology, is potentially attractive for that. The problem is just about everything else connected with Venezuela. And so that's the issue that really all these companies have, which is there are so many different conditions that have to be put in place in terms of legal frameworks, guarantees they're not going to have their assets expropriated again. The fiscal framework, at the moment, Venezuela has one of the most unfavorable fiscal frameworks in terms of favorability to the industry of any country in Latin America. They're going to need to know that there'll be support from future US administrations as well. Clearly, the Trump administration has made its views very clear, but political cycles turn. There'll be a different administration at some point in the future. Control of Congress will change. Will future Congresses and administrations want to support US companies operating in Venezuela? They'll want talent to be brought in. There's been a huge exodus, a real diaspora of skilled staff from the Venezuelan oil industry over the past 25 years or so. I don't know if you find this, but you go to many, many different parts of the world, Canada being one of them, but places in the Middle East, all around the world, and you meet people in the oil industry, you'll very often meet people from Venezuela who have fled the country. And I think it would really help the reconstruction of that country's industry if conditions in the country were stable and the economy was growing, and it would persuade people to think they needed to go back there. So again, that's a very important consideration, I think, for the long term. And then finally, I think the other thing which is very important is just that the market conditions have to be right. Going back to your analogy with Iraq, one of the things that happened in terms of the Iraqi industry was that from about 2003, oil prices went on a super cycle, it's often called, in terms of that long upswing. Obviously, turbulence around the financial crisis, turbulence in 2014, 15, 16, when essentially Saudi Arabia decided it didn't want to prop up oil prices and allowed them to fall. But in general, oil has repriced to a higher level, and that repricing really helped oil production in Iraq grow, encouraged investment, meant that there was a market for that oil.
Yeah.
This, I think, is a bit of an imponderable now in terms of Venezuela, right? Are we going to get that same kind of upward shift in oil demand and pricing that's going to create that market for Venezuela's oil over the next, let's say, decade and beyond?
Well, and there is, to that point, there's something of a apparent contradiction or paradox or whatever, which in terms of what the US administration wants, right? Because on the one hand, it talks about stimulating oil production. I'm thinking of Trump's famous drill, baby, drill comments before the election and opening up exploration on federal lands and all this other stuff, and now Venezuela. But on the other hand, they also seem very determined to have lower oil prices, as far as I can tell. So, and obviously if you increase production, prices will come down, but low prices are at odds with the investment required to increase production. So is there a way to reconcile those two views?
Yes, there is. And I think that's the position the administration hopes the industry will get to. But I mean, I think one of the things that it's important to think about here is that, of course, drill, baby, drill hasn't happened, right? The rig count in terms of rigs actually drilling the US has gone down over the past year, not up. And when you think about what the priorities of the Trump administration are overall, I think personally that their view very much favors lower oil prices rather than higher. When you think about why was President Trump elected, what was a critical issue in that 2024 election, it was affordability. It was the surge in inflation under the Biden administration. Clearly, inflation's come down a lot since then. Interest rates have started to come down, but definitely, if you can do something to improve affordability for American consumers, you want to bring down the price of gasoline at the pump. You want to bring down inflationary pressures for everything that is carried on a truck that uses diesel or gasoline. And so for the US economy as a whole, roughly speaking, oil prices are a wash. That the oil price goes up, bad for consumers, good for people who work in the oil industry and people who invest in the oil industry.
Mm.
But because the US is, roughly speaking, self-sufficient in oil, it's actually just like net oil exporter, net, it's kind of a wash for the US economy. It has distributional effects within the economy. So same thing on the downside then, when the price of oil goes down, it's not net a win or a lose for the economy. It just redistributes resources away from the oil industry, obviously concentrated in a few locations, particularly in Texas, and distributes them to the US population at large, to US consumers. And also then by taking inflationary pressure out of the economy makes it easier for the Fed to cut rates. And as we know, that's a big priority for the Trump administration, getting the Fed to cut rates. So on balance, I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration would favor a lower oil price over a higher one. The way that gets reconciled, to go back to your question, is that the administration expects the US oil industry to adjust. And this is something that Chris Wright, the energy secretary, has talked about. He's drawn an analogy with what happened when prices collapsed in that 2014, 15, 16 period, is he said the industry became more efficient, productivity grew, costs were cut, and the industry learned to survive with prices at a lower level. And as he rightly says, it happened then. He's arguing it can happen again. And it is definitely the case that, I was saying earlier, there is a lot of interest in the US oil industry now in improving productivity, improving recovery factors, what they call. So in other words, how much of the oil that's in the ground can be brought out of the ground. That's a key focus for the oil majors, for Chevron and Exxon, and also for the smaller companies increasingly. So that's a way that you can increase production without drilling a whole load more wells, therefore increasing your productivity, reducing your cost per barrel. So that's a big focus. And that, I think, is, as I say, the way the administration plans to square that circle is by encouraging the industry to become more productive. But as I say, I think if they had to choose between keeping the oil industry happy and keeping American consumers at large happy, they would very much choose to support consumers and make them happy. That's their priority.
Yeah. So then we could talk about this for hours, but we sort of, just to wrap it up. What then? How then should we think about more broadly about the U.S. government's policy with respect to other oil producers? I mean, obviously, we've had Venezuela. I mean, before Christmas, you had the U.S. was bombing another OPEC producer, Nigeria. That's slightly been forgotten, I think, given everything else that's going on. Obviously, everybody's paying very close attention now to Iran and what might happen there. I mean, is there a broader shift going on here in terms of US interest in or influence over the oil market more generally, or do you see this as being a bit more opportunistic?
I do think this is a bit more ad hoc rather than really reflecting a new strategy and vision with respect to the oil market on the part of the US. I think it particularly boils down to this question of the importance of the Monroe Doctrine still now in 2026, and the US seeing the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence, and very much aligning with the whole sort of America First idea, and thinking that it's those threats and opportunities that are near to the country, that are close and immediate, those are the ones that should be the priority for foreign policy, not more distant ones. So I absolutely don't think this is going to be a precursor to broader US intervention for oil. Well, certainly not in the sense of invasions and troops on the ground, anything like that. I absolutely don't think we're going to see that. I think the Iran situation is really interesting, as you say, because everyone's watching it very closely. Iran, a very significant oil producer, and there is absolutely a possibility that increased turbulence, strikes in particular, I see it being talked about, could disrupt oil production and oil exports out of Iran. And that's then going to push prices up. And you've actually already seen some movement to that effect in the markets, that just the possibility of disruption has driven crude prices up a bit. And so that's sort of a complicating factor, really, for the administration, that certainly regime change in Iran is very much something they would support, but a period of disruption that hits the oil market, drives up crude prices, therefore drives up gasoline prices for US consumers, that's not something they're going to want to see. And so there's a delicate balance to be struck, and possibly some other policy responses to be adopted in terms of maybe getting a bit more hands-on in oil markets and fuel markets to hold prices down. We've seen that obviously from the Trump administration just recently in terms of things like capping credit card interest rates. President Trump talking about that in terms of direct intervention in the defense industry and so on. Maybe the oil industry now is going to be the next one where the administration takes a more hands-on position in order to try and shield US consumers from some of the impacts we might see as a result of upheavals in Iran.
Well, that's a fascinating thought on which to end. Ed, this has been a really fantastic. We have to leave it there, unfortunately, but very much appreciate your time. And we'll come back and hear more about the crazy world of oil at some point in the future.
It's been great talking to you. Thanks very much.
That's our show this week. Thanks to Ed for that great conversation. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich with the help of Mike Copeland, John Hodge, and Sunita Barthfort in the studio in London. You can check out a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday. Don't forget to tune in to our sister show Viewsroom every Thursday, as well as all the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions, and ideas, please email us at breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you liked what you heard, please rate the show and leave us a review. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.